November 1885. Samuel Crawford ordered a wife through the mail. The woman who stepped off that stagecoach was not what he had ordered. The bitter Wyoming wind showed no mercy to the handful of townspeople gathered at the depot in Copper Creek that gray afternoon. Samuel Crawford stood among them, a man of 41 years, built of sharp angles and weathered hands, shifting his weight from one boot to the other as the leather creaked in the frozen silence. Inside his coat pockets his hands trembled, and he hated himself for it. He hated the vulnerability of this moment, the exposure of his loneliness laid bare for the entire town to witness. He had spent the last month building a fortress of expectations in his mind. A sturdy woman he had imagined, perhaps a widow from Ohio, with broad shoulders and hands as calloused as his own. Someone who understood that life on the frontier was not a romance to be swooned over, but a negotiation with the elements, a daily bargain struck with the land itself. He needed a partner, not a prize. He needed someone who could help him hold the line against the encroaching winter and the loneliness that echoed through his empty ranch house like a physical weight pressing on his chest. The infertility that had ended his first marriage 3 years ago was a secret he carried like a stone lodged in his gut. Sarah had left him not with anger, but with a quiet, devastating pity, taking with her the last shreds of his belief that he deserved anything more than a practical arrangement. A marriage of labor, he had told himself, not legacy, just survival. When the stagecoach finally rattled into view, emerging from the swirling snow like a dark beetle navigating a sea of white, the conversation on the platform died instantly. Mrs. Abigail Porter, a woman of 55 and the town's self-appointed keeper of moral standards, and the woman who had helped facilitate the correspondence with the mail-order bride agency, stepped forward. She clutched her shawl tight to her throat, her eyes bright with the anticipation of fresh gossip to sustain her through the long winter ahead. Samuel felt his heart hammer against his ribs, a dull and heavy rhythm that seemed too loud for his chest. The horses snorted, their flanks heaving with exhaustion as the driver pulled on the reins and brought the coach to a shuddering halt in the mud and slush. Samuel stepped forward, his boots sinking into the muck, his eyes fixed on the door as the handle turned. He expected the sturdy widow of his imagination to descend boots first, ready to critique the mud and the cold and the ramshackle state of frontier life. Instead, the door swung open, and a silence more profound than the winter wind descended upon the crowd. The woman who stepped down was slight, almost fragile in appearance, wrapped in layers that seemed woefully insufficient for the biting cold. She wore a gray prairie dress that looked too fine for the rugged terrain, the fabric rippling in the wind, like water. But it was the bright red scarf wrapped intricately around her neck and head that drew every eye. A splash of violent color against the monochrome world, defiant and beautiful and utterly out of place. She was Chinese. Her features were delicate and set in an expression of guarded exhaustion, her dark eyes scanning the faces of the stunned townspeople before landing with terrifying precision on Samuel. The silence stretched until it became a physical thing, a heavy blanket of judgment and confusion that smothered the platform. Mrs. Porter let out a small strangled sound, her hand flying to her mouth, as if she had witnessed a scandal rather than an arrival. Samuel felt the blood rush to his face, a burning heat that had nothing to do with the temperature. He saw the way the men loitering near the general store porch leaned forward, their eyes narrowing, exchanging glances that ranged from amusement to open hostility. This was not the sturdy partner he had ordered. This was a mistake, a clerical error, a cosmic joke played on a man who had asked for very little from life and apparently deserved even less. The woman stood by her single, modest trunk, her hands clasped in front of her, shivering slightly, but holding her chin high, with a pride that Samuel recognized immediately. She looked entirely out of place, like a porcelain cup sitting on an anvil, and the absurdity of the contrast made Samuel feel a surge of something he had not expected. Not embarrassment, not disappointment. Something closer to a protective instinct warring with his own confusion. He realized with a sinking sensation that the town was waiting for him to reject her, to send her back on the next stage, to make a scene that would feed their conversations for the rest of the winter and confirm what they all already suspected about him, that he was a failure, that even a mail-order bride arrangement was beyond his capabilities. But as he looked at her, he saw the tightness around her eyes, the way her knuckles were white from gripping her own fingers, and he recognized the terror of someone who had traveled halfway across the world only to land in a place that looked at her like a curiosity at best and a threat at worst. He could not be another cruel thing in her life today. He would not. Samuel moved before he had fully made the decision, his long legs carrying him through the slush, until he stood before her, blocking the prying eyes of the town with the breadth of his shoulders. He felt clumsy and hulking next to her, a giant made of rough timber standing beside a willow branch. He took off his hat, ignoring the snow that immediately began to settle on his graying hair and cleared his throat. The sound came out rough and rusty, like a gate that had not been opened in years. "Miss," he said, his voice lower than he intended, rumbling in his chest. "I'm Samuel Crawford." She looked up at him, her expression unreadable, though he thought he saw a flicker of relief behind the stoicism. She nodded once, a sharp, precise movement, and reached into her sleeve to pull out a folded piece of paper, the letter of arrangement he had signed months ago through the agency. She held it out, not as a greeting, but as a receipt, a proof of her right to be there. "I am Mei Ling," she said, her voice quiet but clear, carrying a lilt that sounded like music against the harsh vowels of the frontier. "I am here for the agreement." The word hung in the air, stripped of any romantic pretense, practical and cold. Mrs. Porter bustled forward, then recovering her wits, her voice shrill enough to cut through the wind. "Mr. Crawford, surely there has been a mix-up. The agency promised a woman of suitable background for this climate." Samuel saw Mei Ling's posture stiffen, her eyes fixing on the horizon, as if she could will herself away from this moment, away from this judgment. He turned to Mrs. Porter, his face hardening into the stone mask he wore to keep the world at bay. "The lady is here, Mrs. Porter," he said flatly, "and the weather isn't waiting." He reached down and hoisted Mei Ling's trunk with one hand, the muscles in his arms straining against the fabric of his coat, and nodded toward his wagon parked at the edge of the platform. "Let's go," he said to her, not unkindly. It was the first small victory, the first time Samuel Crawford chose kindness over shame, protection over self-preservation. And though he did not know it yet, it was the moment that would change everything. The ride out to the ranch was an exercise in excruciating silence. The only sounds were the rhythmic crunch of the wheels over the frozen earth and the occasional snort of the horses cutting through the cold air. Samuel sat rigidly on the bench, his eyes trained on the road ahead, though his peripheral vision was entirely consumed by the presence beside him. Mei Ling sat with her back straight, not leaning against the seat, her hands folded in her lap, with a stillness that spoke of years of practiced composure. The gray dress was thin, and Samuel could see the way the wind cut through it, making her shoulders tremble in minute spasms she tried desperately to suppress. The red scarf fluttered around her face, the only vibrant thing in miles of sagebrush and snow, a small rebellion against the bleakness. Samuel felt persistent guilt settle in his gut. He had brought a heavy wool blanket intending to drape it over the shoulders of a sturdy farm woman, but now offering it felt intimate and presumptuous. Yet the shivering was undeniable, and he could not let her freeze simply because he was too awkward to extend a basic kindness. He cleared his throat, the sound startling in the quiet, and reached behind the seat, pulling out the thick, scratchy wool. "Ma'am," he said, offering it to her without looking directly at her face, his eyes still fixed on the horizon. "Wind cuts sharp out here. Best cover up." Mei Ling looked at the blanket, then at his hands, large hands scarred from years of barbed wire and fence posts and hard labor, holding the wool with a tentative gentleness that contradicted their appearance. She took it, her fingers brushing his glove for a fraction of a second, and nodded. "Thank you," she whispered, her accent soft and musical. She wrapped the blanket around herself, burying her face slightly in the warmth, and for the first time Samuel saw her shoulders drop an inch. The tension leaked out just enough to reveal the exhaustion underneath the bone-deep weariness of someone who had traveled too far on too little hope. They rode on two strangers bound by a piece of paper and a lack of better options, heading toward a home that Samuel suddenly feared was far too small to hold the weight of their combined awkwardness. As they traveled, Samuel found himself pointing out landmarks without quite knowing why. "South Creek runs through there," he said, nodding toward a frozen ribbon of water barely visible through the snow. "Best fishing in the spring if you have a mind for it." Mei Ling turned her head slightly, acknowledging the information with a small nod. She said nothing, but Samuel noticed the way her eyes tracked the landscape, assessing, cataloging, absorbing. She was not passive, she was observing, learning, and somehow that made him feel less alone. The arrival at the Crawford Ranch did nothing to dispel the growing knot of anxiety in Samuel's chest. If anything, seeing his home through the eyes of a stranger made it look shabbier, smaller, and more desolate than it ever had before. The cabin was a sturdy, low-slung structure made of weathered logs that had turned the color of iron in the dimming light. It hunkered down, against the wind, as if trying to disappear into the landscape. A thin trail of smoke rose from the chimney, snatched away instantly by the gusts, and the corral fences leaned slightly under the weight of accumulated snowdrifts. It was a bachelor's fortress, a place designed for sleeping and eating between hours of breaking one's back in the fields. Not a home for a woman, and certainly not for a woman who looked like she had stepped out of a watercolor painting. Samuel pulled the wagon up to the front, the brake lever screeching a protest that echoed off the nearby barn. He jumped down the snow, crunching loudly under his boots, and moved to help her down. But Mei Ling was already descending, navigating the high step with a grace that made his offer of assistance look clumsy before he could even extend his hand. She landed lightly in the snow, her gray hem immediately soaking up the moisture, and looked up at the house. Her expression remained guarded, her dark eyes taking in the rough-hewn logs, the lack of decoration, the mud-splattered windows. Samuel felt the need to apologize, to explain that he had not had time to whitewash the timber or plant a garden or make the place look like anything other than what it was, a lonely man's shelter. But the words stuck in his throat, feeling trivial against the vastness of the reality facing them. Inside the cabin was warm but stark, filled with the scent of wood smoke, old coffee, and the unique musk of a life lived alone. The furniture was utilitarian, a heavy oak table, two mismatched chairs, a narrow cot in the corner that served as a sofa, and his bed in the back room separated only by a heavy curtain. Dust motes danced in the shaft of light cutting through the single window as Samuel pushed the door open, revealing the clutter of his existence. A pile of mending he had ignored for weeks. A stack of ledgers on the table, dirty plates from breakfast still sitting near the basin. He saw Mei Ling's eyes sweep over the room, cataloging every detail, every speck of dust, every sign of his solitary neglect. She did not recoil, but she did not smile either. She simply observed her face, a mask of polite neutrality that told him nothing of what she was thinking. "It ain't much," Samuel said, his voice echoing in the small space as he set her trunk down near the curtained partition. "It's warm mostly. Roof holds." He rubbed the back of his neck, feeling the heat rise in his cheeks again. "I reckon you could take the back room for privacy? I'll sleep out here on the cot." He wanted to make it clear that he expected nothing from her, that the word wife on the paper did not mean he felt entitled to her affection or her body, especially when he felt so profoundly unworthy of either. Mei Ling looked at the curtain, then back at him, her gaze steady. "You are kind," she said softly, though the words felt formal, almost rehearsed, as if she had practiced what to say in such a moment. She walked over to the table and ran a finger along the edge, inspecting the dust. Not with judgment, Samuel realized, but with the air of someone assessing a task, a problem to be solved. "This is adequate," she said finally. The words stung more than Samuel expected. Adequate, a lukewarm appraisal of his life's work, but he nodded, accepting it because what else could he do? He busied himself with the stove, adding wood with unnecessary force just to have something to do with his hands. "I'll get supper started," he muttered. "Beans and salt pork and less." He paused, realizing too late that he knew nothing of her customs, her tastes, her life before this moment. "Unless you don't eat that." Mei Ling watched him fumble with the skillet, her head tilted slightly to the side. "I can cook," she said, taking a step toward him. "It is part of the arrangement." Samuel shook his head quickly, stepping back as if to shield her from the drudgery of the stove. No, you've had a long travel. You rest. I've been feeding myself for 20 years. I can manage one more night." He wanted to prove his competence, to show her that while he might not be wealthy or refined, he was capable of care. But as he turned back to the stove, he knocked a tin of coffee grounds off the shelf with his elbow, sending dark granules scattering across the floorboards like a small explosion. The noise was startlingly loud in the quiet cabin. Samuel froze, staring at the mess, feeling the humiliation burn through his ears and down his neck. Before he could move, Mei Ling was there, crouching down, her gray dress pooling around her like water, scooping the precious grounds into her small cupped hands with careful, deliberate movements. "Waste not," she murmured, looking up at him. Her voice was gentle, without mockery. In her eyes, Samuel did not see pity. He saw something far more terrifying: patience. A quiet, enduring patience that unnerved him more than anger ever could. It was the patience of someone who had survived worse than a clumsy man and a mess of coffee grounds. And in that moment, kneeling on his dirty floor, carefully salvaging what could be salvaged, she looked not like a burden he had acquired, but like someone who already understood the value of small things. It was a moment of normalcy, a breath. And against all odds, Samuel felt the corner of his mouth twitch upward in something that might, in time, become a smile. The next morning broke with a sky the color of a bruised plum, the temperature dropping low enough to freeze the water in the basin solid. Samuel woke before dawn, his back aching from the narrow cot, driven by a frantic energy to prove his worth before Mei Ling even opened her eyes. He wanted the chores done, the animals fed, the path cleared, before she had to face the harshness of the day. He felt like he was on probation in his own home, auditioning for a role he was not sure he could play. He moved through the morning routine with manic intensity, chopping wood with heavy, heaving swings, carrying water buckets, until his shoulders screamed, ignoring the biting wind that whipped around the corner of the barn. He wanted her to wake up to a world that was managed, tamed, safe. But the harder he tried to smooth the edges of the frontier for her, the more the frontier seemed to fight back. The pump handle stuck, requiring boiling water to loosen. The chickens were skittish and refused to lay. The heavy gate to the south pasture had sagged off its top hinge, dragging in the snow like a broken limb. Samuel was sweating despite the cold, his breath coming in ragged gasps, when he looked up toward the house and saw her. Mei Ling was standing at the window, the red scarf wrapped around her shoulders like a shawl, watching him. She was not doing anything, just watching her stillness, a sharp contrast to his flailing exertion. Samuel felt a spike of shame. He must look like a fool to her, a man fighting a losing war against his own land. Distracted by her gaze, Samuel turned back to the gate and yanked it hard, trying to force the warped wood into place. The timber, swollen with moisture and ice, splintered under his grip, and a jagged shard sliced across the palm of his glove, tearing the leather and biting into the skin beneath. He hissed in pain, dropping the gate, which swung back and hit him squarely in the shin. Samuel doubled over, cursing silently under his breath, clutching his hand. It was a small injury, the kind he ignored daily, but happening now under her scrutiny, it felt like a catastrophic failure of competence. He squeezed his eyes shut, breathing through the throbbing in his hand, feeling the weight of his own inadequacy pressing down on him like the sky itself. But before he could wallow further, he heard the crunch of footsteps, not from the house, from the road. Samuel straightened up, wiping his bloody glove on his trousers, and turned to see a horse and rider approaching through the morning mist. It was Garrett Blackwood, his neighbor to the east, a man of 46, whose loudness was matched only by his ambition to swallow up the smaller ranches around him like a predator consuming prey. Blackwood was a large man, red-faced and perpetually angry, sitting high on a bay gelding that looked as mean-spirited as its owner. Samuel felt his stomach drop. Garrett never came over for a social call, and certainly not at sunrise in weather like this. Garrett did not bother dismounting. He reined his horse in just outside the fence line, the animal dancing nervously in the snow, steam blasting from its nostrils in great clouds. The gelding tossed its head, metal bit clinking sharply in the cold air, sensing its rider's agitation. "Crawford!" Garrett bellowed, his voice booming across the frozen yard, shattering the morning quiet like a gunshot. Samuel walked toward the fence, keeping his injured hand tucked into his coat pocket, trying to project a calm he absolutely did not feel. "Morning, Blackwood," he said, keeping his voice level and measured. "Something wrong." Garrett spat a stream of tobacco juice into the pristine snow, leaving a dark, ugly stain. "Wrong, I'd say so. Found 3 of your steers on my south range this morning, mixing with my herd, eating my feed." Samuel frowned, confusion warring with rising dread. "That's impossible. I checked the perimeter fence 2 days ago. It's sound." Garrett laughed, a harsh barking sound that held no humor. "Well, it ain't sound now. Maybe if you spent more time fixing your wire and less time ordering fancy women from catalogs, you'd keep your stock where it belongs." The insult landed like a physical blow. Samuel stiffened, his jaw tightening until it ached. He knew the town was talking. He had expected that. But hearing it thrown in his face by Garrett Blackwood, delivered with such casual cruelty, made the shame burn hot and bright in his chest. "Leave her out of this," Samuel warned, his voice dropping an octave into something dangerous. "If my stock is out, I'll fetch them. No harm done." "No harm?" Garrett leaned forward over the pommel of his saddle, his face twisting into a sneer that exposed yellowed teeth. "My bull is prize stock, Crawford. I don't need your scrub cattle bringing in sickness or messing with my breeding lines. You get them animals out within the hour, or I shoot them where they stand. And you owe me for the feed they consumed." It was an unreasonable demand, a bully's tactic designed to assert dominance and humiliate. The feed consumed in one night was negligible, worth maybe a few cents. And shooting stray cattle over a fence dispute was an act of war in this valley, a violation of the unwritten code that kept neighbors from each other's throats during the long winters. Samuel felt the trap closing around him. If he backed down, he looked weak. If he fought, he risked a feud he did not have the manpower or the resources to win. He stood there, the cold wind biting at his exposed neck, feeling small and outnumbered, even though it was just one man on a horse. He opened his mouth to try and negotiate, to plead for time, fully aware of how pathetic he sounded in his own head. But before he could speak, the front door of the cabin opened. The sound was distinct in the crisp air, a sharp crack of wood on wood. Both men turned. Mei Ling stepped out onto the porch. She had donned a heavy coat over her dress, likely one of Samuel's old ones that he had left hanging by the door. It swallowed her small frame, the sleeves hanging past her hands, but the red scarf was still there, wrapped around her neck, vibrant and defiant against the gray morning. She did not look at Samuel. She looked straight at Garrett Blackwood, her expression calm, bordering on bored, as if this confrontation were nothing more than a mild inconvenience. She held something in her hand, a small dark notebook, the ledger from Samuel's table. She walked down the steps, the snow crunching under her feet, moving not with the hesitation of a newcomer, but with the terrifying purpose of someone who had already assessed the situation and found it wanting. She stopped beside Samuel, barely reaching his shoulder, yet somehow occupying just as much space in the yard as the mounted man before them. She looked up at Garrett, then down at the notebook, and spoke. Her voice cut through the bluster like a knife through canvas, clear and precise, and entirely unafraid. 3 steers, she said, her English heavily accented but perfectly intelligible, brown and white, ear tags, 14-18-22. Samuel stared at her, his mind reeling. He had not even checked the tags yet. He had not inventoried the herd since before her arrival. How could she possibly know which ones were missing? Had she read his ledger that thoroughly in one evening? In the dim light of the cabin while he slept, Garrett Blackwood stared at the small woman standing in the snow, his mouth hanging slightly open, the aggressive sneer faltering into a mask of pure confusion. This was the second twist, the second moment when everything Samuel thought he knew shattered and reformed into something new. And Mei Ling was not finished. She stepped closer to the fence, the hem of her oversized coat dragging in the snow, her face tilted up toward the mounted man with a confidence that seemed to come from nowhere and everywhere all at once. "I saw the ledger," she continued, her voice steady and devoid of the trembling that Samuel felt in his own knees. "And I saw the tracks this morning. The wind blew from the north last night. Your fence line at the creek bottom. The posts are rotted. I saw them when we drove past yesterday." She paused, letting the words sink in like stones dropping into still water. "The wire is down on your side, Mr. Blackwood. Our cattle did not break out. Your fence invited them in." Garrett Blackwood's face flushed a deeper shade of crimson, contrasting violently with the white landscape surrounding them. He gripped the reins tighter, his knuckles whitening against the leather, the bay gelding shifting beneath him as it sensed the sudden change in its rider's confidence. "Now listen here," Garrett sputtered, trying to regain the momentum of his anger, his voice rising to compensate for the ground he was losing. "I don't know how things work where you come from, little lady, but out here a man is responsible for his stock." Mei Ling nodded, conceding the point, with a terrifying calmness that made Samuel's breath catch in his throat. "And a man is responsible for his perimeter," she countered, her voice never rising above conversational volume, which somehow made it cut deeper than any shout could have. "By the county statute, which was also in the book on the table fence, maintenance on a shared boundary is a mutual obligation, but the failure of a structural post falls to the owner of the land where the post stands." She paused, letting that sink in, then delivered the final blow with surgical precision. "The rot is on the east bank. That is your bank, Mr. Blackwood." She closed the small notebook with a soft thump that seemed louder than a gunshot in the frozen silence. "We will fetch the steers. We will not pay for feed that was eaten because of your negligence. If you wish to escalate this to the sheriff, I will bring the ledger and the piece of rotted wood I saw yesterday." Samuel watched, paralyzed by a mixture of horror and awe, as the power dynamic in the yard inverted completely. Garrett Blackwood looked from the small, fierce woman in the oversized coat to Samuel, who was still cradling his injured hand, and back to Mei Ling. The bully had expected a fight with a tired, lonely man. He had not expected a deposition delivered by a woman who looked like she could be blown away by a stiff breeze, but spoke with the authority of a circuit court judge. Only the wind whistling through the fence wires broke the stillness and the nervous stamping of Garrett's horse. Finally, Garrett let out a short, incredulous huff of air. He yanked his horse's head around with more force than necessary, the animal rearing slightly in protest. "You get them out," Garrett growled, though the venom had drained from his voice, replaced by something closer to bewildered retreat. "I'll give you an hour, and fix the damn fence." He kicked the horse into a gallop, snow spraying up behind him in a white plume as he retreated down the road, leaving Samuel and Mei Ling standing alone in the biting cold. Samuel exhaled a breath he felt he had been holding for 10 years. He turned to look at Mei Ling, really look at her for the first time, and found her trembling, not from fear, he realized with sudden clarity, but from the sheer adrenaline of the stand she had just taken. She looked down at the notebook in her hands, her fingers tracing the worn leather cover, and for the first time since stepping off that stagecoach, she looked unsure. "I hope I did not overstep," she whispered, her voice losing its steel and returning to the soft lilt of the night before. But the numbers were clear. Samuel felt something break open in his chest, something that had been locked tight, for 3 long years. "You just faced down the meanest son of a gun in 3 counties," he said, his voice rough with emotion he had not expected to feel. "With a notebook and county statute. That ain't overstepping. That's—" he paused, searching for the right word. "That's remarkable." The ride to Blackwood's pasture to retrieve the wayward steers was a different kind of silence than the one that had filled the wagon the previous day. This silence was not heavy with awkwardness or judgment. It was charged with a stunned curiosity, a recalibration of the world as Samuel knew it. He sat on the buckboard seat, driving the team with practiced ease, while Mei Ling sat beside him, wrapped once again in the wool blanket. Every few minutes, Samuel would steal a glance at her profile, trying to reconcile the image of the delicate mail-order bride with the iron-spined negotiator who had just dismantled the county's biggest bully with nothing but logic and observation. His hand throbbed where the wood had sliced it, a dull ache that grounded him in reality, but the shame of the injury had been replaced by a burning question that he could not quite articulate. He had thought he was bringing a dependent into his home, another mouth to feed another life to protect from the harshness of the frontier. He had prepared himself to be the sole pillar of strength, however cracking and weathered that pillar might be. But as the wagon bumped over the frozen ruts, he realized he had been profoundly wrong. She was not a burden he had to carry. She was ballast, counterweight, and somehow, without him noticing, she had already begun to right a ship he had not realized was listing. When they reached the breach in the fence, the reality of the work set in. The 3 steers were indeed mingling with Blackwood's herd, grazing stupidly on the winter rye that Garrett had planted to sustain his cattle through the lean months. Samuel pulled on the brake and climbed down, wincing as his injured hand flexed. He expected Mei Ling to stay in the wagon. It was cold, muddy work, unfit for a woman in a dress, or so the code of the West dictated. But before he could even unlatch the tailgate, she was there. She had tied the hem of her dress up in a complicated knot that kept it out of the mud, revealing practical leather boots that were clearly too big for her. His old pair Samuel realized with a start, which she must have found by the door that morning, and decided were more sensible than whatever delicate footwear she had arrived in. She moved toward the cattle with a low clicking sound, her arms outstretched, but relaxed her body language, neither threatening nor timid. Just present, confident. Samuel watched mesmerized as she approached the animals with a fearlessness that seemed to come from deep experience. "They're skittish," Samuel warned, stepping forward to intervene, his protective instincts overriding his common sense. "That one on the left kicks." Mei Ling did not flinch. "Animals are like numbers," she said softly, not looking back at him, her eyes fixed on the steer. "They have a logic. You just have to find the pattern." She moved in a careful arc, cutting off the steer's natural escape route without ever making a sudden move. Her presence was commanding, but not threatening. She was reading the animal's body language, adjusting her own position in response, engaging in a silent conversation that Samuel had seen only in the best stockman he had ever known. Samuel found himself falling into a rhythm with her that felt instinctively right, as if they had been working this line together for years instead of hours. He handled the heavy lifting, wrestling the sagging wire back into place and bracing the rotted post while she managed the livestock. Her voice was calm and melodic as she guided the beasts back through the gap, a soothing counterpoint to the wind and the nervous lowing of the cattle. There was no shouting, no cursing, none of the frantic energy that usually accompanied moving cattle alone. Just steady, deliberate work. A partnership of action rather than words. When the last steer was back on Crawford land, Samuel leaned against the wagon wheel, wiping sweat from his brow despite the freezing temperature. He looked at Mei Ling, who was patting the neck of one of the horses, her cheeks flushed pink from the cold and the exertion. She looked small against the vast backdrop of the snowy plains, but she no longer looked fragile. She looked like part of the landscape, like a piece of flint revealed after the snow melts, sharp spark creating and enduring. But as Samuel knelt to examine the fence more closely, something caught his eye that made his blood run cold. The wire was not broken. It was cut. Clean, deliberate cuts made with wire snips, not the jagged tears of weather-induced failure. He ran his fingers along the severed ends, his mind racing. "Mei Ling," he called, his voice tight. "Come look at this." She crouched beside him, her eyes following his pointing finger. Understanding dawned immediately in her expression. "This was done on purpose," she said, her voice flat with certainty. Samuel nodded, his jaw clenching. "Garrett set this up. He wanted an excuse to confront me, to take the land." He stood abruptly, anger flooding through him hot and fast. He cut his own fence and blamed me for it. But Mei Ling was already moving, pulling a small pencil from her coat pocket. With quick, efficient strokes, she sketched the boot prints visible in the mud near the fence post. Large prints, size 12 at least. She carefully removed one of the cut wire pieces and wrapped it in a handkerchief. "We need proof before he destroys the evidence," she said, tucking both items carefully into her coat. "In my village, my father always said when dealing with dishonest men, make their lies visible." They were loading the last of the wire samples into the wagon when the sound of hoofbeats made them both turn. Garrett Blackwood was riding back toward them, and this time he was not alone. Beside him rode Deputy Wade Harris, a man Samuel recognized with a sinking feeling. Wade was in Garrett's pocket. Everyone in the valley knew it, but no one had been able to prove it. Wade was younger than Garrett, maybe 35, with a cruel mouth and eyes that never quite met yours directly. He wore the tin star with an arrogance that suggested he viewed it as a license rather than a responsibility. Blackwood filed a complaint, Wade announced without preamble, his hand resting casually on the pistol at his hip. "Trespassing livestock, destruction of property. He's within his rights to demand compensation." Samuel started to argue, his frustration boiling over, but Mei Ling stepped forward calmly. She pulled out her sketches and the wire sample, holding them up with the same quiet confidence she had displayed earlier. "This fence was deliberately cut," she said, her voice carrying across the frozen field. "The wire shows clean shears, not weather damage, and these boot prints belong to someone who wears size 12. Mr. Crawford wears size 10. Wade barely glanced at the evidence. "Chinaman testimony ain't valid in territorial court," he said dismissively, spitting into the snow for emphasis. The words hit Samuel like a physical blow. He opened his mouth to protest, to defend her, but before he could speak, another voice cut through the tension. "But mine is." They all turned to see Tom Whitaker riding up on his gray mare. Tom was Samuel's nearest neighbor to the west, a quiet man in his late 30s who ran a small cattle operation and generally minded his own business. He dismounted slowly, his eyes fixed on the fence line. "I was checking my own fences this morning," Tom said, his voice measured and deliberate. "Saw Garrett's horse tied up here just after dawn, before Samuel's cattle got through, before he rode over to make his complaint." He walked to the fence and knelt, examining the cuts. Wire didn't break natural. This was cut with purpose. Wade's face darkened, but he could not dismiss Tom as easily as he had dismissed Mei Ling. Tom Whitaker was white male, a property owner, and a registered voter. His testimony carried weight that the deputy could not simply wave away. "Blackwood," Wade said slowly, turning to his benefactor with something new in his eyes. "Uncertainty. You want to press charges, you'll need to make a formal statement, under oath." Garrett's face went through several shades of red and purple. He looked from the evidence to Tom to the deputy, calculating rapidly. Finally, he yanked his horse around without a word and rode off, leaving Wade sitting awkwardly on his mount, clearly unsure what to do now that his patron had retreated. "I'll file a report," Wade muttered, though everyone there knew he would do no such thing. He followed Garrett at a more measured pace, maintaining what little dignity he could salvage. Tom waited until they were both out of earshot before turning to Samuel. "He did the same thing to the Henderson ranch 2 years back," Tom said quietly. "Drove old Bill Henderson out through harassment and trumped-up claims. Bought the land at auction for half what it was worth." He looked at Mei Ling with frank respect. "You stood up to him? That took spine." Samuel felt a swell of gratitude that made his throat tight. "Thank you," he managed, "for speaking up." Tom shrugged. "Should have done it 2 years ago for Henderson. Shame's a heavy thing to carry." He tipped his hat to Mei Ling. "Ma'am, you ever need anything, my ranch is 3 miles west. You got friends here, whether Blackwood likes it or not." As Tom rode away, Samuel and Mei Ling stood together in the snow, the afternoon sun already beginning its early winter descent. The crisis had passed, at least for the moment, but Samuel knew it was far from over. Men like Garrett Blackwood did not give up easily. They adapted. They escalated. That evening the cabin felt different. The starkness that had seemed so oppressive the night before had softened somehow. The corners were filled with the golden glow of the lantern and the smell of roasting potatoes that Mei Ling had found in the root cellar and insisted on preparing. The wind still howled outside, rattling the window panes, but inside there was a new quiet, a companionable peace that settled over the room like a warm quilt. Samuel sat at the table, his hand freshly bandaged. Mei Ling had dressed it with a salve from her trunk that smelled of mint and camphor, her touch efficient and gentle, her fingers moving with the practiced ease of someone who had done such work many times before. He watched her move around the small kitchen, not just existing in his space anymore, but inhabiting it. She had organized the spice jars by height, wiped down the dusty shelves, and placed the ledger back on the table, closed and squared precisely with the edge. It was a partnership of small actions, a language of doing that Samuel understood far better than any poetry ever written. "I underestimated you," Samuel said abruptly, the words breaking the comfortable silence. Mei Ling stopped stirring the pot on the stove and turned to face him, wiping her hands on the apron she had found hanging on a peg. She leaned back against the counter, her expression thoughtful, considering not just his words, but the weight behind them. "You did not know me," she answered simply, her voice holding no accusation, just statement of fact. "Expectations are like a fence, Samuel. They keep things in, but they also keep things out. You expected fragile." Samuel nodded, looking down at his calloused hands resting on the scarred wood of the table. "I expected someone who needed me to be everything," he admitted, his voice dropping to a murmur. "I thought a man's worth was in what he could carry alone. And when I saw you, you looked so—" He paused, searching for words that would not sound insulting. "Light. I thought I'd break you with the weight of this life." He looked up at her, his eyes searching hers for understanding. "But today, you carried the weight. You carried me." Mei Ling walked over to the table and sat opposite him, the lantern light catching in the dark depths of her eyes. She reached out slowly and placed her hand on the table between them, palm up. An invitation, a bridge. "I came here because I wanted a life, not a rescue," she said, her voice firm but tender. "In my village, after the floods took everything, we learned that strength is not about being the stone that never moves. It is about being the water that finds a way around every obstacle." She paused, her gaze dropping to his bandaged hand before rising again to meet his eyes. "You are strong, Samuel. I see how you work this land alone. But you are tired. You wanted a wife to fill the empty chair. But I think you need a partner to hold up the other side of the roof." Samuel felt a lump form in his throat, a painful, sweet obstruction that made breathing difficult. He had been so afraid of his own insufficiency, of the secret shame of his infertility, of being less than what a man should be, that he had not realized what he actually needed. Not to be a savior, just to be seen. And she saw him, not as a failure, but as a man who was simply tired of being alone. Samuel hesitated, his pulse thundering in his ears, before slowly reaching out to cover her hand with his own. His skin was rough-scarred from years of barbed wire and frost, and the unforgiving work of keeping a ranch alive through Wyoming winters. The contrast with the smoothness of her palm was startling, almost shameful to him. But she did not pull away. Instead, she turned her hand over beneath his, interlacing her fingers with his own, in a gesture of shocking intimacy that sent a jolt of warmth straight up his arm and into his chest. "I have to tell you something." Samuel began the confession he had dreaded, sitting heavy on his tongue like lead. Something the letters didn't say, about why there's no family here, why it's just me in this empty house. He took a breath, staring at their joined hands, because looking at her face felt too dangerous, too exposing. "I can't give you children, Mei Ling. The doctor in Cheyenne confirmed it years ago. That's why my first wife left. That's why I'm alone. That's why I could only ask for a practical arrangement instead of a real marriage." He waited for the recoil, for the disappointment, for the practical calculation that this arrangement was a dead end, a waste of her youth and her hopes. He braced himself for her to pull her hand away, to stand up, to ask about the next stagecoach back to San Francisco. But Mei Ling's grip only tightened. She looked at him with an expression that softened into something profoundly gentle, something that made his chest ache with a longing he had thought dead and buried with his first marriage. "Samuel," she said, speaking his name with a reverence he was not accustomed to hearing. "Do you think I traveled across an ocean and half a continent just to be a mother? I came to be a wife. I came to build a home." She squeezed his hand, anchoring him to the moment, to the reality of her presence. "Children are a blessing, yes, but they are not the only harvest worth tending. We have land, we have this house, we have our hands and our minds and our will to survive." She leaned forward slightly, her eyes locking onto his with a fierce intensity that took his breath away. "Family is not just blood, Samuel. It is who stays when the winter comes. You stayed for me on that platform when everyone expected you to send me away. You stood between me and their judgment. That is enough. You are enough." The words washed over him like warm water, dissolving the knot of shame that had lived in his gut for 3 long years. He looked at this woman in a gray dress with a red scarf, this stranger who had stepped off a stagecoach less than 2 days ago, and saw not a mistake or a burden, but the center of a world he had not known he was building. He realized then that romance was not about flowers or poetry or grand gestures. It was this. It was the quiet admission of flaws and the steady promise to stay anyway. It was the warmth of her hand in his and the way she looked at him like he was worth the trouble. It was a pact made not of paper, but of shared strength and mutual respect. "Then we build," Samuel whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "We build it together." The peace of that moment lasted exactly 3 days. On the 4th morning, Samuel was checking the south fence line when he found the water well. The bucket came up clouded and foul-smelling. When he peered down into the darkness, he saw the bloated body of a rat floating on the surface, clearly dead for at least a day. Poisoning a man's well was not just vandalism. It was attempted murder. It was a declaration of war. He ran back to the barn to grab tools for cleaning the well and found 3 sections of fence cut cleanly through the wire, hanging loose and useless. Cattle from the north pasture had wandered through the gaps during the night, scattering across open range where they could be lost to weather or predators or simply disappear into the vastness of Wyoming territory. But it was what he found painted on the barn door that made his blood turn to ice. In rough dripping letters someone had written, "Chinaman, go home." Samuel stood there staring at the ugly words, his hands clenching into fists so tight his fingernails bit into his palms. He heard footsteps behind him and turned to see Mei Ling emerging from the cabin, her eyes finding the message immediately. He watched her face, waiting for tears, for fear for the breaking point that would send her running back to whatever safety San Francisco might offer. But her face simply hardened, her jaw set, her eyes went cold and focused in a way that reminded Samuel of a blade being sharpened on a whetstone. She did not cry. She did not flinch. "He is afraid," she said quietly, walking up to stand beside Samuel. "Men who are winning do not resort to this." Before Samuel could respond, the sound of hoofbeats drew their attention. Tom Whitaker was riding up fast, his gray mare lathered despite the cold. He dismounted in a rush, his face grave. "Samuel, we need to talk," Tom said without preamble. "Garrett's doing to you what he did to Henderson. He'll escalate until you can't defend yourself anymore, then he'll buy your land at auction when the bank forecloses." Tom's eyes flicked to the barn door and his expression darkened further. "This is worse than I thought." "What do we do?" Samuel asked, hating the helplessness in his own voice. Tom glanced at Mei Ling, then back to Samuel. "You need allies, and you need them now. I know someone who can help, someone who survived worse than Garrett Blackwood." An hour later, a woman arrived on horseback, sitting her mount with the easy confidence of someone born to the saddle. She was perhaps 45 years old, with features that spoke of mixed heritage. Native American and Chinese, Samuel guessed, though he knew better than to ask directly. She wore practical riding clothes and a wool coat, her long black hair streaked with gray and braided down her back. "This is Sarah Chen," Tom said by way of introduction. "Folks call her Red Bird. She runs the boarding house in town." Red Bird dismounted and extended her hand to Samuel first, then to Mei Ling. When Mei Ling took it, Red Bird spoke a few words in rapid Cantonese. Mei Ling's eyes widened in surprise and relief, responding in the same language. It was the first time Samuel had heard her speak her native tongue, and the fluency and speed of it reminded him how much she had been holding back, how much effort it took for her to navigate this world in a language that was not her own. After a brief exchange, Red Bird switched back to English. "Tom told me what's happening. Garrett Blackwood is a disease in this valley. He hates anyone who's different, and he's got enough money and connections to make that hate dangerous." She looked at the barn door, her expression hardening. "He did similar to me 15 years back. Tried to run me out when I first opened the boarding house. Said a half-breed Chinaman had no business running an establishment in a decent town." "What did you do?" Mei Ling asked. Redbird smiled, but it was not a warm smile. It was the smile of someone who had fought and won. "I made myself indispensable. Became the best cook in 3 counties. Made sure the circuit judge always had a clean room and a hot meal when he came through. Built relationships with people who mattered more than Garrett ever could." She turned to Mei Ling directly. "You're not fighting him alone. You're fighting the fear he represents, and fear only wins if good people stay silent." She paused, letting that sink in. "I'll help however I can. You need a place to stay that's safer than out here. My door's open. You need testimony about his character. I've got stories." The sound of another rider approaching made them all turn. Doc Harrison came into view, his black bag bouncing against his saddle. He was a man in his early 60s with kind eyes behind wire-rimmed spectacles and the perpetually tired look of someone who had seen too much suffering and not enough healing. "Heard there was trouble out here," Doc said, dismounting with the stiffness of age. "Thought I'd check in." Samuel showed him the well, the cut fences, the painted threat. Doc examined each with the methodical care he would give a patient, taking notes in a small book he pulled from his vest pocket. "This is evidence," Doc said firmly. "Pattern of harassment. I'll document it officially." He turned to Samuel, his expression serious. But there's something else you should know. Word around town is that Garrett's filed a complaint with the immigration office, questioning the legitimacy of your marriage." The words hit Samuel like a punch to the gut. Mei Ling went very still beside him. "He's claiming it's a marriage of convenience." Doc continued, his voice gentle but unflinching. "Says you only married her to get cheap labor, and she only married you to get citizenship. There's going to be a hearing in 2 weeks. Samuel felt the world tilting beneath him. "Can he do that?" Doc nodded slowly. "Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882 makes it complicated for Chinese immigrants to gain legal status even through marriage. You'll have to prove the marriage is genuine. That means showing you have a real relationship, not just a paper arrangement." He paused, clearly uncomfortable with what he had to say next. "The judge will ask intimate questions about your living arrangements, your knowledge of each other, whether the marriage has been consummated." Samuel felt his face burn. Beside him, Mei Ling's cheeks flushed pink, but her voice remained steady. "What do we need to do?" "I'll testify that I've witnessed genuine affection between you," Doc said. "I've seen how you care for each other, but you'll need more than that. You'll need witnesses who can speak to the authenticity of your relationship, and you'll need to be able to answer those questions yourselves." That evening, as the sun set early behind the mountains, Samuel and Mei Ling sat at the kitchen table, attempting to prepare for questions they could barely imagine being asked aloud. Doc had left them a list of things the judge might ask, and the intimacy of it was more awkward than anything Samuel had experienced since adolescence. "Where did we first meet?" Mei Ling read from the list. "The depot in Copper Creek," Samuel answered. "What was your first impression of me?" Samuel paused, considering honesty versus propriety. "I was scared," he admitted finally. "Terrified that I'd made a terrible mistake, that you'd take one look at my life and demand to go back." "And what was my first impression of you?" she asked, her eyes finding his across the table. "I don't know," Samuel said. "What was it?" Mei Ling set down the paper. "I thought you looked like a man who had forgotten how to hope. But when you gave me the blanket in the wagon, I thought maybe there was still kindness left in you. Kindness I could work with." The rehearsal continued, questions and answers that started as performance and slowly became revelation. They learned things about each other that the crisis and work had not allowed time for. Samuel learned that Mei Ling's favorite color was the deep blue of twilight, that she missed the smell of silk and sandalwood, that she had a younger brother who drowned in the flood and whose loss still haunted her dreams. Mei Ling learned that Samuel's mother had died when he was 12, that he had built this ranch from nothing with his father before losing him to pneumonia, that his first wife's name was Sarah, and that she had left not with anger but with pity, which somehow hurt worse. They were so absorbed in the conversation that neither noticed the smell of smoke until it was almost too late. Samuel's head jerked up, his nostrils flaring. "Do you smell that?" Mei Ling was already moving toward the window. "The barn," she said, her voice sharp with alarm. "It's on fire." They burst out of the cabin into the freezing night to see flames licking up the side of the barn, orange and terrible against the black sky. The horses inside were screaming their panicked whinnies, cutting through the roar of the fire. Samuel ran without thinking, his only thought to reach the animals before they burned alive. He could hear Mei Ling behind him shouting something, but the blood pounding in his ears drowned out her words. He reached the barn door and yanked it open, smoke billowing out in a choking cloud. The heat hit him like a physical wall, but he pushed through, his eyes streaming, his lungs burning. He could see the horses in their stalls, wild with terror, throwing themselves against the wooden walls. He moved to the first stall, fumbling with the latch when he heard Mei Ling's voice behind him. "I will get the other side," she shouted over the roar of flames. "You take these too." There was no time to argue, no time to protect her or shield her from danger. They worked in desperate tandem, flinging open stall doors, guiding terrified horses toward the exit. Samuel's horse, a big sorrel gelding named Rusty, bolted past him, nearly knocking him down. Mei Ling's smaller frame was almost trampled by the mare she released, but she pressed herself against the wall and let the animal rush past. They were almost clear when Samuel heard the ominous crack of wood above them. He looked up to see a support beam, eaten through by fire, beginning to give way directly above where Mei Ling stood. "Move!" he roared, throwing himself across the space between them. He hit her with his shoulder, driving them both sideways, just as the beam crashed down where she had been standing a second before. They tumbled together into the snow outside the barn, rolling away from the collapsing structure. Samuel's coat was smoldering, his left arm seared where a burning ember had caught him. The pain was immediate and excruciating, but all he could think about was whether Mei Ling was hurt. "Are you all right?" he gasped, pulling her to her feet. She nodded, coughing, her face smudged with soot. "You're burned." By the time Tom Whitaker and two other neighbors arrived with buckets and shovels, having seen the glow from miles away, the barn was half destroyed. They worked through the night, containing the fire, preventing it from spreading to the house or the other outbuildings. By dawn, all that remained of the barn was a smoking skeleton of blackened timbers and ash. Samuel sat on the porch steps, his arm bandaged by Doc Harrison, who had arrived with the neighbors. The burn was second-degree painful, but not life-threatening. Two of the horses had minor injuries from their panicked escape, but all had survived. Mei Ling emerged from the cabin with coffee, her hair still damp from washing away the smoke and soot. She sat beside him, close enough that their shoulders touched, and they watched the sun rise over the ruins of the barn together. "He did this," Samuel said, his voice flat with exhausted certainty. "Garrett did this." "I know," Mei Ling said quietly. She leaned her head against his shoulder, a gesture of trust and weariness. "But we survived. The animals survived. The house stands." Samuel turned to look at her, this woman who had faced fire and fear without breaking and felt something shift irrevocably in his chest. "You could have died in there." "So could you," she whispered. "You pushed me out of the way." "I won't let him hurt you," Samuel said, the words coming out fierce and raw. "I don't care what it costs me. I won't let him take you." Mei Ling lifted her head to look at him, her eyes searching his face in the gray dawn light. And then, without words, without warning, she leaned in and kissed him. It was brief, desperate tasting of smoke and fear and something sweeter beneath. When she pulled back, her eyes were wet. "We can't just defend anymore, Samuel," she said, her voice steady, despite the tears. "We have to attack, find his weakness. Everyone has one." And in that moment, sitting in the ashes of his barn with this woman in his arms, Samuel realized something. He had fallen in love. Not with the idea of companionship or the comfort of not being alone. He had fallen in love with Mei Ling Chen, with her fierce intelligence and her unbreakable will, and the way she refused to be anything other than exactly who she was. "The ledger," Mei Ling said suddenly, sitting up straight. "I remember seeing entries about Blackwood's debts. He owes the bank significant money. He needs this land for collateral to extend his loans." Samuel stared at her. "How do you know that—" "I read it," she said simply, "in the county records book on your shelf. You had notes about property transactions." She stood, helping him to his feet. "If we can prove he's using illegal means to acquire land because he's desperate, financially, we can turn his own weapon against him." As the sun fully crested the horizon, painting the snow gold and pink, Samuel Crawford realized that he had not rescued Mei Ling from anything. She had rescued him. From loneliness, yes. But more than that, she had rescued him from the belief that he had to face the world alone. And together they would face Garrett Blackwood and whatever came next. The morning after the fire, Samuel and Mei Ling rode into Copper Creek with a purpose that burned hotter than any flame Garrett Blackwood could set. The town looked different to Samuel now, its wooden storefronts and muddy streets, no longer just familiar landmarks, but a battlefield where reputation and truth would clash like armies meeting on contested ground. Their first stop was the general store where Lucas Finch kept his modest operation and maintained quiet connections to nearly everyone who mattered in the territory. Finch was a practical man in his 50s with thinning hair and sharp eyes that missed nothing. He sold everything from nails to calico fabric, and in the process he heard every piece of gossip and business that flowed through Copper Creek. "Mr. Finch," Samuel said as they entered the bell above the door announcing their arrival, "I need to ask you about something delicate." Finch looked up from his ledger, his eyes taking in Samuel's bandaged arm and Mei Ling's soot-smudged dress that no amount of washing had completely cleaned. "Heard about your barn," he said quietly. "Shame. Fine structure." "It wasn't an accident," Samuel said bluntly. "And I need to know something. Garrett Blackwood's financial situation. You hear things. I need to know if he's in trouble." Finch set down his pencil slowly, his expression carefully neutral. "That's dangerous knowledge to share, Samuel. More dangerous than what he's already doing to us?" Mei Ling asked, her voice calm, but pointed. Finch studied her for a long moment, then sighed. "He owes the Territorial Bank in Cheyenne. Substantial sum. Took out loans to expand his operation 3 years back, but cattle prices dropped. He's been scrambling ever since." He lowered his voice. "Word is, he needs to consolidate land to use as collateral or the bank will foreclose." "Can you connect us to someone at the bank who would confirm this?" Samuel asked. Finch shook his head. "They won't testify publicly, too much at stake, but I can get you copies of documents if they exist in county records." He paused. "Off the record, you understand?" "I understand," Samuel said, "and I'm grateful." By that afternoon they had the documents. Loan papers that showed Garrett Blackwood was indeed drowning in debt, leveraged to a degree that would require either a miracle or aggressive land acquisition to survive. It was the motive they needed, the weakness Mei Ling had suspected. But having evidence and having support were two different things. "We need to call a meeting," Tom Whitaker said when they met at his ranch that evening. "Get people together. Let them see what's really happening." "Who'll come?" Samuel asked, doubt creeping into his voice. "Most folks are scared of Garrett. They won't stand against him." Tom's jaw set. "Then we remind them what happens when good people stay quiet." 3 days later, Reverend Elijah Cole, a man of 54 with gentle eyes and a silver-streaked beard that spoke of years spent counseling troubled souls, stood at the front of his small church looking out at the 15 townspeople who had gathered in response to his invitation. Some had come out of curiosity, others out of genuine concern. Mrs. Abigail Porter sat in the back row, her face a mask of skepticism and barely concealed judgment. Samuel and Mei Ling sat together in the front, their hands clasped visibly on the pew between them. Samuel could feel the weight of eyes on them, the town, measuring them, weighing their worth against their strangeness. Reverend Cole cleared his throat. "We are gathered because there is a matter of justice that needs airing. Samuel Crawford has asked to present evidence of harassment and intimidation. I ask that we listen with open hearts and clear minds." Mei Ling stood, and Samuel saw several people shift uncomfortably. A Chinese woman speaking in a church was not something Copper Creek was accustomed to. But she held herself with such quiet dignity that the room fell silent despite itself. She walked to the front and spread out the documents and evidence they had gathered on a table the Reverend had provided. Maps showing property boundaries, copies of loan documents, sketches of the cut fence wire, photographs of the barn ruins that a traveling photographer had taken for insurance purposes. "My name is Mei Ling Chen Crawford." She began, her accent clear, but her words precise. 3 weeks ago, I arrived in this town as a stranger. I am still a stranger to many of you, but what is happening to my husband is not about me. It is about a pattern. She pointed to the map. In 1883, the Henderson Ranch was foreclosed after mysterious cattle deaths and property damage. Garrett Blackwood purchased it at auction. In 1884, the Morrison property experienced similar problems. Blackwood now owns that land, too. 3 months ago, the Wilson family left the valley after their well was poisoned. The room stirred. People exchanged glances. This was information they knew separately but had never seen laid out as a connected thread. "Now it is happening to us," Mei Ling continued. "Cut fences, poisoned well, arson, and behind it all Garrett Blackwood, who needs land to cover his debts to the Territorial Bank." Mrs. Porter stood abruptly. "Why should we trust a Chinaman?" she demanded, her voice shrill. "You come here, marry our men for citizenship, and now you want us to turn against our own." The words hung in the air like poison. Samuel started to rise, anger flooding through him, but Mei Ling placed a gentle hand on his shoulder, keeping him seated. She turned to face Mrs. Porter directly. "You are right that I am not from here," Mei Ling said quietly. "But neither were your grandparents, Mrs. Porter. I have read the church records. Your family came from Pennsylvania in 1861. You were strangers once, too." The observation landed with unexpected force. Mrs. Porter's face reddened, but before she could respond, Doc Harrison stood. "I'm not a stranger," Doc said, his voice carrying authority. "Been in this valley 40 years, and I'm telling you Mrs. Crawford is speaking truth. We've been too scared to say out loud." He looked around the room. "How many of us have lost something to Garrett Blackwood and said nothing because we were afraid? How many times have we watched him bully and scheme and destroy and we looked away?" Silence answered him. The kind of silence that comes from shame, recognized but not yet confronted. Then slowly a rancher named Peter Schultz stood. He was a man in his 60s, weathered and bent from decades of hard work. "He tried to buy my land 5 years back," Peter said quietly. "When I refused, my irrigation ditch got blocked. Never could prove it was him, but I knew." Another man stood. "Lost 20 head of cattle to a grass fire that started on his property line. Fire marshal said it was accidental, but I saw boot prints leading away from where it started." One by one, people began to speak. Stories of intimidation, of property damage, of threats veiled and open. The pattern Mei Ling had outlined became undeniable as the community's individual wounds were revealed as parts of a larger injury. Reverend Cole raised his hand for quiet. "The question before us is simple. Do we stand together, or do we continue to fall separately?" The vote, when it came, was not unanimous. 5 people, including Mrs. Porter, abstained, but 10 stood in support, pledging to testify if needed to bear witness to what they had experienced and observed. It was not everything, but it was enough to shift the ground beneath their feet. What Samuel did not know What he could not have known was that at the exact moment the church meeting was happening, Garrett Blackwood sat in his study, a glass of whiskey in his hand, and rage simmering in his blood. Deputy Wade Harris stood before him, hat in hand, delivering news that made Blackwood's jaw clench. "They're organizing," Wade said, his voice uneasy. "Got half the town at the church right now, listening to that Chinese woman." Blackwood slammed his glass down hard enough to crack it. "A Chinaman is turning my own neighbors against me." He stood pacing like a caged animal. This was supposed to be simple. Squeeze Crawford, buy the land cheap, consolidate my holdings. But that woman has made everything complicated. Wade shifted his weight. "What do you want me to do?" Blackwood turned his mind, working through options. "I called in a favor. Judge Morrison owes me money from a poker game 3 years back. He'll preside over the immigration hearing, and he'll rule the marriage fraudulent. Once she's deported, Crawford will crumble. Lose the land within 6 months. And if they have evidence for the hearing?" Wade asked. "Then we make sure Crawford can't present it." Blackwood said, his voice cold. "File charges. Something that will stick long enough to disrupt their preparation." Wade looked uncomfortable. "On what grounds?" "I don't care," Blackwood snarled. "Assault, trespassing, theft. Make something up. You wear the badge. Use it." The plan was set in motion with terrible efficiency. 2 days later, Samuel was repairing the fence line on the eastern boundary when he heard hoofbeats approaching. He looked up to see Deputy Wade Harris riding toward him, accompanied by another man Samuel recognized as a territorial marshal from Cheyenne. But it was not the marshal who spoke first. It was Wade. "Samuel Crawford," Wade said, his voice carrying official weight he clearly enjoyed wielding, "you're under arrest for assault on Garrett Blackwood." Samuel stared at him in disbelief. "Assault? I haven't touched Garrett Blackwood." Wade pulled out a warrant. "He's got a bruise on his jaw and 2 witnesses who say you struck him during an altercation 3 days ago. You'll need to come with me." "That's a lie," Samuel said, his voice rising. "I haven't seen him in a week." The marshal, a man named John Baker, who looked to be in his late 50s with gray hair and tired eyes, stepped forward. "I'm here to observe, not to interfere with territorial law," he said carefully. "But I will say that you have the right to post bail and prepare a defense." Samuel's mind raced. The timing was deliberate. The immigration hearing was in 1 week. If he was in jail, if his attention was divided, if Mei Ling had to face the hearing without him prepared, they would lose everything. "How much is bail?" he asked, his voice tight. $500, Wade said, and Samuel heard the satisfaction in his tone. It was a sum he did not have readily available. It would require selling livestock or equipment, things he could not afford to lose before winter. Wade smiled coldly. "Hearing's in 3 days. Should give you plenty of time to think in that cell." Samuel was led to a jail cell that smelled of old tobacco, sweat, and defeat. The iron bars were cold under his hands as he gripped them, staring out at the darkening street. Every hour that passed was another hour Mei Ling was alone at the ranch, vulnerable to whatever Blackwood planned next. He imagined her face when she learned of his arrest, the fear she would try to hide behind that calm mask she wore. The night stretched endlessly. Samuel sat on the thin cot, unable to sleep, his mind circling through worst scenarios like vultures over carrion. What if Blackwood sent men to the ranch while he was locked up? What if Mei Ling tried to defend the property alone and got hurt? The helplessness ate at him worse than any physical pain. By morning, when footsteps echoed in the hallway, Samuel's eyes were red-rimmed from lack of sleep and anxiety that had eaten at him worse than physical pain. He expected Wade coming to gloat. Instead, the jailer appeared, unlocking the cell door. "Someone's here to post bail," the jailer said gruffly. Samuel stepped into the hallway and saw Tom Whitaker standing at the front desk, leading a horse, visible through the window behind him. Tom was counting out bills from a leather pouch, his face grim. "I sold my best mare this morning," Tom said, dismounting. "Got $450 for her. Should be enough with what you can scrape together, Samuel." Wade's face darkened. "This is official business, Whitaker. And this is official money," Tom said, pulling a roll of bills from his coat. "Legal tender. You going to refuse it, deputy?" The transaction was completed with visible reluctance from Wade, who clearly had hoped to keep Samuel locked up longer. But within the hour, Samuel was freestanding outside the jail with Tom and Marshal Baker. "Thank you," Samuel said to Tom, his voice rough with gratitude. "I'll pay you back." "You can pay me back by winning," Tom said simply. Marshal Baker cleared his throat. "Mr. Crawford, I came to Copper Creek because I received a telegraph about potential corruption and intimidation. I've been watching. I've been listening." He paused. "I can't interfere with territorial law, but I can observe the immigration hearing as a federal representative. And I can tell you that I've seen enough to know something rotten is happening here." It was not a promise of help, but it was hope. And hope was more than they had yesterday. That evening, Mei Ling visited Samuel at the ranch where he sat at the kitchen table, his head in his hands. The weight of it all, the barn, the arrest, the looming hearing pressed down on him like physical weight. "Maybe you should go," he said without looking up. "Back to San Francisco, where it's safe. I can't protect you from this. I can't even protect myself." Mei Ling walked around the table and knelt beside his chair, taking his face in her hands and forcing him to look at her. Her eyes were fierce, blazing with a determination that took his breath away. "I did not cross an ocean to run from small men with small minds," she said, her voice low and intense. "I came here to build a life, with you, and I will not let Garrett Blackwood or anyone else take that from us." She stood, pulling him to his feet. "We have 1 week to prepare, 1 week to gather evidence, to practice our testimony, to show that judge that what we have is real." Her hands gripped his shoulders. "Is it real, Samuel? What we have?" Samuel looked at her, this woman who had faced fire and fear and hatred without breaking, and felt the truth of it settle in his bones. "Yes," he said, "it's real. You're the realest thing in my life." "Then we fight," Mei Ling said. "Together, like we've done everything else." Through the window they could see the lights of town in the distance. Tomorrow Mei Ling would teach basic mathematics to the children of the families who had supported them at the church meeting, showing the community that she was not a threat, but a contributor. Tomorrow they would begin preparing in earnest for the hearing that would determine whether they had a future together or whether the law would tear them apart. But tonight they stood together in the small cabin, two people who had found in each other something neither had known they were searching for. Not rescue, not convenience, but partnership, the kind that could weather storms and stand against those who would see it destroyed. Outside, the first snow of early winter began to fall, covering the burned remains of the barn in white, making everything clean and new again. It was a reminder that even after destruction, there was always the possibility of beginning again, and Samuel Crawford, for the first time in 3 years, believed in that possibility. The county courthouse in Copper Creek was a modest building of rough-cut stone and timber built to withstand Wyoming weather and the occasional outburst of frontier justice. On the morning of February 1st, 1886, it was packed to capacity. Every bench was filled, and townspeople stood along the walls, their breath creating a humid fog in the heated air. They had come to witness, to judge, and perhaps to gossip about what would surely be the most talked-about event of the winter. Samuel sat at the front table, his hands clasped so tightly his knuckles had gone white. Beside him, Mei Ling sat with her back straight, the red scarf around her neck like a banner of defiance. She wore her best dress, carefully mended and pressed, and her hair was pulled back in a simple bun that spoke of practicality rather than vanity. Judge Morrison entered from his chambers, a stern man of 59, with iron-gray hair and eyes that had seen too many liars to be fooled easily. He carried himself with the weight of authority, and the room fell instantly silent as he took his seat behind the bench. Marshal John Baker sat in the back, observing as promised. His presence was a small comfort, a reminder that not all authority was corrupt, though Samuel knew the marshal had no power to intervene in territorial immigration matters. Across the aisle, Garrett Blackwood sat with his lawyer, a slick man from Cheyenne named Vernon Pierce, who wore a suit too fine for Copper Creek and carried himself with the arrogance of someone who had never lost a case he cared about winning. Blackwood's face was carefully neutral, but Samuel could see the satisfaction lurking beneath the surface. Judge Morrison banged his gavel once. "This hearing will come to order. We are here to determine the legitimacy of the marriage between Samuel Crawford and Mei Ling Chen Crawford under the provisions of the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882. He looked over his spectacles at both parties. "Mr. Pierce, you may present your case." Vernon Pierce stood with theatrical precision, buttoning his coat as he moved to the center of the room. "Your Honor, this is a simple matter of fraud. Mr. Crawford, a lonely rancher in desperate need of labor, paid an agency to secure a woman. Mrs. Crawford, a Chinese immigrant seeking citizenship, accepted the arrangement, knowing it would provide her legal status she could not otherwise obtain." He walked to his table and picked up a sheaf of papers. "I present evidence of payment to the Rocky Mountain Matrimonial Agency, $50 for the arrangement, a business transaction, not a marriage of genuine affection." Samuel felt Mei Ling's hand find his under the table, squeezing gently, anchoring him. Pierce continued, warming to his performance. "Furthermore, witnesses will testify that upon her arrival, the couple maintained separate sleeping quarters, that they barely knew each other, that this was and remains a marriage of convenience designed to circumvent federal law." He turned to face Samuel directly. "Mr. Crawford is a man known to be incapable of fathering children due to medical infertility. What woman would genuinely choose such a match unless motivated by factors other than affection?" The words struck like physical blows. Samuel felt his face burn with shame. The old wound reopened in front of the entire town. He started to stand to object, but Mei Ling's hand tightened on his, keeping him seated. The government's position, Pierce concluded, is that this marriage is fraudulent and should be dissolved with Mrs. Crawford subject to immediate deportation. Judge Morrison nodded slowly. Mr. Crawford, you may present your defense. Samuel had no lawyer. He could not afford one on his rancher's income, especially after the barn fire and the bail money. But he had something more valuable. He had the truth, and he had people willing to speak it. Doc Harrison was the first to take the stand, his medical bag resting at his feet, as if he might be called away at any moment to attend to someone suffering. He placed his hand on the Bible and swore to tell the truth. Doc Samuel said, standing awkwardly, unused to the formality of questioning, "You've seen me and Mei Ling together. What's your assessment of our relationship?" Doc looked directly at the judge. "I've practiced medicine in this valley for 40 years. I know the difference between people living together out of convenience and people who care for each other. I've seen Mrs. Crawford tend to Mr. Crawford's injuries with a gentleness that speaks of genuine concern. I've seen him risk his life to protect her from a burning barn. That's not convenience. That's love." "But they maintained separate rooms," Pierce interjected from his seat. Doc turned to him with the patience of a teacher addressing a slow student. "They did initially, yes, out of respect and propriety. But if you're asking me whether I believe this marriage has been consummated, I can tell you that based on my medical observations and the nature of their interactions, yes, I believe it has." A murmur ran through the courtroom. Samuel felt his ears burn, but he kept his eyes forward. Tom Whitaker took the stand next, his testimony simple and direct. "I've seen them work together like they've been partners for years, not weeks. She knows his cattle by ear tag. He knows how she takes her coffee. That's the kind of knowledge that comes from living a life together, not play acting." Redbird spoke with quiet authority about the conversations she had with Mei Ling in Cantonese, about the way the young woman spoke of Samuel with genuine affection, about the hope in her eyes when she described building a future together. And then, unexpectedly, Mrs. Abigail Porter stood and asked to testify. The room went silent. Mrs. Porter had been vocal in her skepticism, her judgment of the match, her belief that Mei Ling did not belong. Samuel exchanged a glance with Mei Ling, both of them confused. Mrs. Porter took the stand, her hands shaking slightly as she placed them on the Bible. When she spoke, her voice was quieter than Samuel had ever heard it. "I was wrong about her, Mrs." Porter said, not looking at anyone in particular. "I judged her before I knew her. I saw what was different instead of what was true." She finally raised her eyes to meet Mei Ling's across the courtroom. "She's been teaching mathematics to my granddaughter these past weeks, for free, because she said education should be available to all children." Mrs. Porter's voice grew stronger. "I've watched them together at church, at the general store. And what I see is what I had with my own husband before he passed. Respect. Partnership. The kind of quiet love that doesn't need to shout to be real." She looked at Judge Morrison. "This marriage is genuine, Your Honor, and I'm ashamed I didn't see it sooner." The testimony hit the room like thunder. If Mrs. Porter, the town's harshest critic, had changed her position, what did that say about the rest of them? Judge Morrison leaned forward. "Mrs. Crawford, I'd like to hear from you directly. Please take the stand." Mei Ling stood smoothing her dress and walked to the witness stand with a composure that made Samuel's heart ache with pride. She placed her hand on the Bible, swore the oath, and sat her hands folded in her lap. "Mrs. Crawford," the judge said, his voice not unkind but searching, "tell me about the moment you decided to marry Mr. Crawford." Mei Ling took a breath. "I was in San Francisco working in a silk shop. The owner's son would not leave me alone, and I had no family to protect me. The mail-order bride arrangement was not about citizenship. It was about choosing my own path instead of waiting for someone else to choose it for me. And when you arrived and saw Mr. Crawford for the first time, what did you think?" "I thought he looked terrified," Mei Ling said, and a ripple of laughter went through the courtroom. "But then he stepped forward and protected me from judgment. He gave me his blanket when I was cold. He offered me privacy when he could have demanded otherwise. I thought, this is a man who knows what it means to be kind, even when it costs him something." Judge Morrison made a note. "The prosecution argues this marriage has not been genuine because you maintained separate quarters." "We did," Mei Ling said steadily. "At first, because Samuel respected me enough not to assume I owed him intimacy just because of a paper. But that changed." She paused, her cheeks coloring slightly. "It changed when we nearly died together in a barn fire, when I realized that what I felt for him was not gratitude, but love." She turned to look directly at Samuel, and the courtroom seemed to fall away. "He knows I take my coffee with honey, but no cream. I know he talks to his horses when he thinks no one is listening. He knows I am afraid of deep water because of the flood that killed my family. I know he blames himself for something that was never his fault." Her voice grew stronger, more passionate. "Marriage is not one moment of vows. It is 1,000 small moments of choosing to stay. We choose, every morning when we wake, every night when we plan the next day. Every time we face people who say we do not belong together, we choose each other." The words hung in the air like cathedral bells, resonating with a truth that could not be manufactured or faked. Samuel felt tears prick his eyes, his throat tight with emotion. Pierce stood. "Your Honor, emotion is not evidence." But Judge Morrison held up his hand. "I'll determine what constitutes evidence, Mr. Pierce." He turned back to Mei Ling. "Thank you, Mrs. Crawford. You may step down." Samuel took the stand next his large frame, making the witness chair seem small and fragile. He placed his work-worn hand on the Bible that had never expected to touch anything as delicate as the woman sitting across from him. "Mr. Crawford," Judge Morrison said, "you paid $50 to the matrimonial agency. That's a fact. Why should I believe this is anything more than a business transaction?" Samuel took a breath, gathering his thoughts. "Your Honor, I ain't educated. I don't have fancy words. But I know what's real and what ain't." He looked at Mei Ling. "I paid that money because I was lonely and scared and figured a practical arrangement was all I deserved. I thought I was getting a workhorse, if I'm honest. Someone to help keep the ranch going." He paused, his voice growing rougher with emotion. "But what I got was a partner. Someone who's smarter than me, braver than me, and sees the world in ways I never could. She knows my cattle by ear tag because she read my ledger in one night and memorized it. She stood up to the biggest bully in the valley with nothing but logic and courage. She ran into a burning barn to save my horses." Samuel's voice broke slightly. "I was half a man before she came, broken by loss and shame and loneliness. She didn't fix me. She just showed me I didn't need fixing. I needed someone who'd stand beside me, not behind me or in front of me. Beside me." He looked directly at the judge. "I love her, not the idea of having someone. Her, Mei Ling. And I'll spend every day of the rest of my life proving it if you'll let me." The courtroom was utterly silent. Even Pierce seemed at a loss for words. Judge Morrison removed his spectacles and cleaned them slowly, a deliberate pause that stretched every nerve in the room to breaking. Finally, he replaced them and looked up. "This is clearly a genuine relationship," he said, and Samuel felt hope surge in his chest. "However, given the scrutiny this case has attracted and the provisions of the Chinese Exclusion Act, I cannot make this determination lightly." The hope began to curdle into dread. "I am granting a 30-day continuance," Morrison continued. "You will reconvene on March 3rd. During this period, I expect the relationship to continue as described. I will make my final ruling at that time." It was not rejection, but it was not approval. It was a limbo that would hang over them for another month. Garrett Blackwood stood abruptly. "Your Honor, surely there's enough evidence here to rule immediately." Judge Morrison's eyes turned cold. "Mr. Blackwood, you are not a party to these proceedings. Sit down." The dismissal was public and sharp, and Samuel saw Blackwood's face redden with humiliation as he sank back into his seat. Outside the courthouse, as they walked toward their wagon, Samuel felt simultaneously relieved and terrified. 30 more days of uncertainty. 30 more days for Garrett to scheme and sabotage. As if summoned by the thought, Garrett appeared at their wagon, Vernon Pierce nowhere in sight. His face was twisted with barely controlled rage. "This ain't over, Crawford," he said in a low voice, meant only for them. 30 days is a long time. Lots can happen. Accidents, losses. You might find it's easier to just give up and let her go back where she came from." Before Samuel could respond, Mei Ling stepped between them. "We survived your fire," she said calmly. "We survived your lies. We will survive whatever you do next, because we are not alone anymore." The truth of it seemed to strike Garrett harder than any physical blow. He looked around and saw Tom Whitaker watching from across the street, Doc Harrison standing on the courthouse steps, Redbird emerging from the general store, a dozen eyes on him witnessing his threat. He backed away, his bluster deflating. 30 days, he muttered, and walked away. That night, as Samuel and Mei Ling prepared for bed in the cabin, the wind began to howl with a ferocity that spoke of something worse than normal winter weather. By morning, a blizzard had descended on Copper Creek Valley with apocalyptic fury. The snow fell so thick and fast that the world disappeared beyond the cabin windows. Wind shrieked through every crack, and the temperature plummeted to depths that made breathing painful. Samuel woke to find ice forming on the inside of the windows, his breath visible even inside the cabin. They were trapped, cut off from town, from help, from everything except each other. On the second day of the blizzard, Samuel checked on the cattle and found his worst fear realized. 15 head were trapped in the south pasture, huddled against a fence line, with no shelter, slowly freezing to death. Without them, he would lose a quarter of his herd. Without the herd, he could not survive the winter financially. "I have to go get them," Samuel said, staring out at the wall of white. "Then I go with you," Mei Ling said immediately. "It's too dangerous. You could die out there." Mei Ling took his face in her hands, forcing him to look at her. "We go together, or we stay together. Choose." So they went together, roped at the waist to keep from losing each other in the white void. The world became nothing but wind and snow and the burning cold that seeped through every layer of clothing. Visibility was measured in inches, not feet. Samuel navigated by feel and memory, following the fence line with frozen hands. They found the cattle exactly where Samuel feared, on the edge of succumbing to the cold. Mei Ling used her voice, that calm musical quality, cutting through the storm, calling to the animals with a confidence that made them respond. Together, they herded the half-frozen beasts back toward the barn, moving by instinct and partnership. Samuel slipped into a snowbank, the ground disappearing beneath him. He felt himself sinking, the cold wrapping around him like a vice, and panic flared. But then Mei Ling was there, her small body pulling with strength that seemed impossible, the rope between them holding fast. She dragged him out, and they collapsed together in the snow, clinging to each other. "I've got you," she gasped. "I've got you." And Samuel realized she did. She had him in ways he had never been held before. They made it back to the cabin with all 15 cattle frostbitten and exhausted, but alive. For 3 days they were trapped together in that small space, sharing body heat, sharing whispered conversations in the dark, sharing a bed out of necessity that became something more. On the 3rd night, lying together under every blanket they owned, Samuel finally said the words that had been building in his chest like a dam about to break. "I love you." Not the arrangement, not the idea. "You, Mei Ling, just you." In the darkness, he felt her smile against his shoulder. "Woye Aini," she whispered. "I love you too." And in that moment, with the blizzard raging outside and the warmth of her body against his, Samuel Crawford understood what home truly meant. It was not a place, it was a person, it was this. Spring came to Copper Creek Valley with the tentative hope of a survivor emerging from a long siege. The snow melted in patches, revealing earth that had been buried for months, and the creek swelled with runoff that sang through the valley like a promise of renewal. By late February, the roads were passable again, and life cautiously resumed its rhythms. Samuel and Mei Ling emerged from their winter cocoon, changed. The blizzard had stripped away the last pretenses between them, leaving only the raw truth of what they had become to each other. They moved through the work of the ranch with the synchronized efficiency of people who had learned to read each other's intentions without words. But Garrett Blackwood had not been idle during the freeze. On March 1st, 2 days before the immigration hearing was scheduled to reconvene, a writer arrived at the Crawford Ranch with legal papers. Samuel read them twice, his stomach sinking with each word before handing them to Mei Ling. "He's suing me for theft," Samuel said, his voice hollow. "Claims I stole cattle from his land and sold them. Says he has witnesses." Mei Ling's eyes scanned the document, her expression hardening. "This is desperation. He knows he's losing, so he's trying to make you look like a criminal before the immigration hearing." "If I'm convicted of theft, you lose your case," Samuel said. "They'll say you married a criminal to get citizenship." "Then we prove him wrong," Mei Ling said simply. But Samuel could hear the fear beneath her calm, the understanding that they were running out of time and options. That night, unable to sleep, Mei Ling sat at the kitchen table going through Samuel's papers and books for the 100th time, searching for anything they might have missed. She pulled out an old leather folder she had not examined before, its contents yellowed with age. Inside she found a deed, not to the Crawford Ranch itself, but to the water rights for South Creek, the waterway that ran through both Crawford and Blackwood properties. The document was dated 1867, signed by Samuel's father when he first claimed the land. Mei Ling's hands began to shake as she read the technical language, her mind translating the legal terms into their practical implications. The water rights for South Creek belonged exclusively to the Crawford Ranch, which meant that for the past 10 years Garrett Blackwood had been using water he had no legal right to access. It was the leverage they needed, the weakness she had promised to find. "Samuel!" she called, her voice tight with controlled excitement. "Samuel, wake up!" The trial was scheduled for March 2nd, one day before the immigration hearing. The courthouse was packed even fuller than before, if such a thing were possible. Every rancher in the valley seemed to have found a reason to be in town that day, crowding into the building or standing in the muddy street outside, listening through open windows. Garrett Blackwood sat at the prosecutor's table with Vernon Pierce, his expression confident. He had witnesses lined up, men he had paid or intimidated into supporting his version of events. Deputy Wade Harris sat prominently in the front row, a visible symbol of Blackwood's influence over local law enforcement. But this time, Marshal John Baker was not merely observing. He had opened a federal investigation into corruption in Copper Creek, and his presence at the defense table beside Samuel and Mei Ling sent a clear message that the old rules no longer applied. Judge Morrison called the court to order, his expression grave. "Mr. Blackwood, you have accused Mr. Crawford of cattle theft. Present your evidence." Vernon Pierce stood his confidence undiminished. "Your Honor, we have 3 witnesses who will testify that they saw Mr. Crawford driving Blackwood cattle across the property line in late January. Furthermore, Mr. Blackwood's herd count shows a shortage that corresponds exactly to cattle Mr. Crawford sold to a buyer in Cheyenne. The first witness was a ranch hand who worked for Blackwood, a young man named Billy Tucker, who could not meet Samuel's eyes as he testified. His story was rehearsed mechanical, and Pierce led him through it with practiced ease. But when Marshal Baker stood to cross-examine, something shifted. "Mr. Tucker," Baker said quietly, "how much is Mr. Blackwood paying you to be here today?" Tucker's face went red. "I don't know what you mean." "I mean the $20 he gave you yesterday. I have a witness who saw the transaction." Baker produced a paper from his coat. "And I have your gambling debts from the saloon." "Interesting that they were all settled yesterday morning." Pierce shot to his feet. "Objection, this is harassment of the witness." "Overruled," Judge Morrison said sharply. "Answer the question, Mr. Tucker." Tucker's resolve crumbled. "He said it was just to cover my time away from work," he mumbled. "But I didn't really see nothing. He told me what to say." The courtroom erupted. Morrison's gavel came down hard, demanding silence. When order was restored, the second and third witnesses suddenly developed convenient memory problems, their testimonies falling apart under the marshal's questioning. Then Mei Ling stood. "Your Honor," she said, her voice clear and unwavering, "I would like to present evidence." She walked to the front of the courtroom and spread out documents on the table. Maps, the old water rights deed, her carefully kept ledger of the ranch's cattle counts, and a new item, photographs taken by the traveling photographer of boot prints in the mud near the cut fence with measurements clearly marked. "Garrett Blackwood has been stealing from the Crawford Ranch for years," Mei Ling said, and the room went utterly silent. "But not cattle. Water." She pointed to the deed. "This document grants exclusive water rights for South Creek to the Crawford Ranch. Mr. Blackwood has been diverting water from this source for 10 years without authorization. According to territorial law, unauthorized use of water rights constitutes theft of natural resources." Blackwood's face had gone from red to purple. "That's ridiculous. Furthermore," Mei Ling continued, ignoring the outburst, "the pattern of harassment we have experienced corresponds exactly to Mr. Blackwood's financial troubles. He needs our land not for expansion, but for survival. The water rights alone are worth more than his current property value." She laid out the timeline with devastating precision. The Henderson Ranch, the Morrison property, the Wilson family, each had water access that Blackwood wanted. Each had experienced mysterious problems before being forced to sell. He cut his own fence to create a pretext for confrontation. He poisoned our well to drive us out. He burned our barn to intimidate us. And now he brings false charges of theft to discredit my husband before our immigration hearing. Her eyes found Blackwood's across the room. "But the only thief in this courtroom is the man who has been stealing our water for a decade." Marshal Baker stood. "I have documentation from the Territorial Land Office confirming Mrs. Crawford's research. I also have testimony from a banker in Cheyenne that Mr. Blackwood is in default on his loans and has been using illegally obtained water to maintain his operation." The case collapsed like a house built on sand. Pierce tried to object, to redirect, to salvage something, but there was nothing left to salvage. The truth had been laid bare for everyone to see. In the back of the courtroom, Reverend Cole stood, then Doc Harrison, then Tom Whitaker. One by one, 30 townspeople rose to their feet in silent support, a physical manifestation of community standing against corruption. Even Mrs. Abigail Porter stood, tears streaming down her weathered face. "I'm sorry," she said, her voice breaking. "I'm so sorry I didn't see it sooner. Forgive me." Judge Morrison surveyed the room, his expression unreadable. Finally he spoke. "Mr. Crawford, you are exonerated of all charges. Furthermore, I am issuing a judgment against Mr. Blackwood for illegal use of water rights harassment and attempted fraud. You are fined $5,000, ordered to cease all use of South Creek water immediately, and required to pay restitution for damages to the Crawford property." He turned to Deputy Wade Harris. "Mr. Harris, your badge is hereby revoked pending investigation into corruption charges. Marshal Baker, please take him into custody." The gavel came down with the finality of thunder. Garrett Blackwood sat frozen, his empire crumbling around him in real time. Vernon Pierce was already gathering his papers, distancing himself from a client who had become a liability. "This ain't over," Blackwood said, but his voice lacked conviction. It was the protest of a man who knew he had already lost. Samuel stood slowly reaching for Mei Ling's hand. "Yes," he said quietly, "it is." The immigration hearing the following day was almost anticlimactic. Judge Morrison reviewed the previous day's proceedings, the testimony about the genuineness of Samuel and Mei Ling's relationship, and the visible transformation in how the community viewed them. Based on the evidence presented, Morrison said, his voice formal but not unkind, "I find that the marriage between Samuel Crawford and Mei Ling Chen Crawford is legitimate and genuine. Mrs. Crawford is hereby granted permanent residency in the United States territory of Wyoming." The courtroom, packed once again with supporters, erupted in applause. Mei Ling felt tears stream down her face, not from sadness, but from the overwhelming relief of a burden finally lifted. Samuel pulled her into his arms, holding her as if she might disappear if he let go. Outside, the spring sun was warm on their faces. Tom Whitaker clapped Samuel on the back. Redbird embraced Mei Ling, whispering words of congratulation in Cantonese. Doc Harrison shook both their hands with genuine warmth, and Mrs. Porter approached hesitantly, her eyes red-rimmed. "I judged you wrongly," she said to Mei Ling. "You've shown more grace and strength than I've ever had. Would you forgive a foolish old woman?" Mei Ling took her hands. "There's nothing to forgive. You stood up when it mattered. That's all any of us can do." By summer, the valley had transformed in ways both visible and invisible. Garrett Blackwood sold his ranch at a loss and left Wyoming territory last seen heading toward Montana with what little remained of his fortune. The Crawford Ranch, with its newly secured water rights and the support of neighboring ranchers, began to thrive in ways Samuel had never imagined possible, but the most significant change was the one that could not be measured in acres or cattle or dollars. The Town Harvest Festival in late August was a celebration unlike any Copper Creek had seen in years. Tables groaned under the weight of food, children ran wild between the dancing adults, and music filled the air with joy. Samuel and Mei Ling danced together in the town square, her red scarf bright as a flame around her shoulders, his hands gentle on her waist. They moved with the easy comfort of people who had learned each other's rhythms through shared hardship and shared triumph. "You taught me something," Samuel said as they swayed to the fiddle music. "That strength isn't about carrying everything alone. It's about knowing who to trust to help carry it." Mei Ling smiled up at him. "And you taught me that home is not a place you come from. It's a place you choose, and people who choose you back." As the evening light turned golden, casting long shadows across the valley, they stood together, watching the community they had helped transform. Not through grand gestures, but through quiet persistence and the simple act of refusing to let hate and fear win. In September, a letter arrived from San Francisco. Mei Ling read it twice before showing it to Samuel, her hands trembling. "My cousin Jade," she said. "She's 16. Her parents died of influenza. She has no one." Samuel did not hesitate. "Then she comes here, to us. Family is who stays when winter comes. Remember, we're her family now." The second miracle came in October, announced by Doc Harrison, with a mixture of professional satisfaction and personal joy. Mei Ling was pregnant. Against all odds, against all the doctor's pronouncements about Samuel's infertility, new life was growing. "Stress can affect fertility in ways we don't fully understand," Doc explained. "Sometimes when a man stops carrying the weight of the world alone, his body remembers how to hope again." Samuel wept openly, his large hands cradling Mei Ling's still flat belly with a reverence usually reserved for sacred things. But it was the third transformation that spoke most powerfully to the legacy they were building. With support from Reverend Cole and funding from ranchers who had prospered under the new cooperative Samuel and Tom had formed, Mei Ling established the first community center in Wyoming territory, specifically welcoming to Chinese immigrants and other newcomers. It was a small building, nothing grand, but it offered English lessons, legal assistance, and most importantly, a place where being different was not a weakness, but a strength to be celebrated. On a cold November morning, almost exactly 1 year after Mei Ling had first stepped off the stagecoach in Copper Creek, Samuel and Mei Ling returned to the depot. The same wind blew, the same gray sky stretched overhead, but everything else had changed. The stagecoach arrived, and Jade Chen stepped down. She was small, dark-haired, frightened, clutching a single trunk and looking desperately for a friendly face in the crowd of strangers. Mei Ling stepped forward, the red scarf bright around her shoulders, and opened her arms. "Welcome home," she said in Cantonese, then in English. "Welcome home." Jade fell into her embrace, and Samuel wrapped his arms around both of them. Three people who had been alone finding family in each other. As they loaded Jade's trunk into the wagon, now reinforced and well-maintained, Samuel noticed Mrs. Porter watching from the general store porch. She raised her hand in greeting, genuine warmth in her smile. He waved back, marveling at how far they had all come. The ride back to the ranch was filled with Mei Ling's voice, translating between languages, explaining the valley, the ranch, the life that awaited. Jade listened with the desperate hope of someone who had been adrift and finally found an anchor. "Is it really okay?" Jade asked in Cantonese. "That I'm here? That you want me?" Mei Ling took her hand. "Family is not just blood," she said, speaking the words that had become her truth. "It's who stays when the winter comes. And your family, Jade. Your home." That evening, as the sun set over the valley, painting the snow-capped mountains gold and crimson, Samuel stood on the porch of the house he had thought would remain forever empty. Inside, he could hear Mei Ling and Jade laughing as they prepared dinner, their voices mixing with the crackle of the fire and the everyday sounds of a home filled with life. He thought about the letter he had sent to the Rocky Mountain Matrimonial Agency, asking for a practical arrangement, a sturdy worker, someone to help him survive the loneliness. He had wanted so little because he believed he deserved so little. But the universe, or fate, or simple chance had given him everything he never knew he needed. A partner who was his equal in every way that mattered. A daughter not of his blood, but of his choice. A child on the way who would carry forward a legacy built not on land or cattle, but on the simple revolutionary act of choosing love over fear. From his pocket he pulled out a folded piece of paper, the original letter from the agency, the one Mei Ling had presented as proof of their arrangement on that first frozen day. He had carried it as a talisman, a reminder of how far they had come. On the back, in Mei Ling's careful handwriting, she had written something in the days after the trial. He read it now, the words as familiar as prayer. "Some love stories are written in starlight and poetry. Ours was written in snow and fire and the stubborn refusal to let the world tell us who we could be. That makes it no less beautiful. Perhaps it makes it more." Samuel smiled, folded the paper carefully, and tucked it back into his pocket. Inside, Mei Ling called his name, asking him to come eat before the food got cold. He turned toward the warm light spilling from the windows, toward the voices of his family, toward the life he had built from the ashes of loneliness and shame. And Samuel Crawford, rancher of Copper Creek Valley, walked into his home, into his future, no longer alone. Epilogue. The Crawford Ranch would grow to become the largest in Copper Creek Valley by 1895, a testament to what partnership and community support could build. Samuel and Mei Ling had 2 biological children against all medical predictions and adopted 3 more over the years, including Jade, who grew up to become a teacher. In 1890, Mei Ling founded the first Chinese-American Community Center in Wyoming, offering language classes, legal assistance, and a safe haven for immigrants navigating a hostile world. It stands to this day, though the building has been expanded 3 times. The red scarf Mei Ling wore on that first frozen day became a symbol in the valley. When other immigrant families arrived uncertain and afraid, they would be welcomed with a red scarf, a reminder that they too belonged, that they too were home. Samuel Crawford died in 1923 at the age of 79, surrounded by children, grandchildren, and a wife who held his hand and told him one last time that he had been enough, more than enough. Mei Ling Chen Crawford lived until 1941, long enough to see her great-grandchildren, long enough to know that the legacy she and Samuel had built would endure. She was buried beside him on the ranch under the Wyoming sky they had both learned to call home. Their descendants still run the Crawford Ranch today, a piece of living history where the past and future meet in the present. And sometimes on cold November mornings when the wind blows just right, you can almost see a woman in a red scarf stepping off a stagecoach and a man who learned that love is not about being perfect, but about being brave enough to choose it anyway. The end.